Knowing all the data, we're going to begin to interpret that, right? So we know that God obviously does not want his people to be anxious about the material, physical needs of their life. That's one thing I can determine based off verse 25. God wants his anxious people to look at creation, to be reminded of his care and his love. We look at the birds and the lilies, We look at how God feeds the birds. What does that mean? Well, God doesn't provide for the birds because of any system they have in place or what they do. It seems as though God feeds them very simply because he's gracious, right? So as I'm interpreting this, what does this mean? Well, it means that God's provision and care for his people is not limited to their efforts and abilities and systems that they've put in place, And as I look at creation and the lilies and the birds, the meaning behind this is that, there's no reason for God's people to be anxious about their future and their physical needs that may arise. It's not good to be overly concerned with the temporary issues of this physical life. Based on the observations that we made in the last video, these are the ways that we can, or these are the conclusions we come to. This means that God doesn't want his people living in the future and neglecting the present, because he says in verse 34, don't be anxious about tomorrow. This means that God clothes and feeds better than anyone could do for themselves, including Solomon. God wants his people to be different from the godless pagans. When Jesus mentions the Gentiles seek after these things and your Father knows them all, well, that means that, God's people should be different than those who don't trust in Yahweh. When God's people trust in his care, they can get to work and focus on his kingdom. That's what this means. When God's people have faith in God, they will look different from the godless pagans, right? That's what this means for us, is that they look and live a certain way, and if we function or rather relate to God differently, then we should live and function a different way. This data tells me that God knows what his people need, and he doesn't want his people to obsess about these things of the future. When I read verse 32, all these things will be added to you. That tells me, God wants to add to his people, but it requires them to trust his word and in his care and provision.